oil fields and the pathway into the
Gulf, yes.
oil line, that then he would accept that and sit back and build up, and 4 or 5 years from now try it all over again. Then we have to send everybody out there.
Okay, ma'am, we'll leave it at that. We've got 30 seconds, Mr.
Right.
King.
Well, that is one option. That's one scenario of what would happen. That's using the Munich example, perhaps, as an historical base. The other option is we go to war, we destroy Hussein, we destroy many, many lives, and the two great powers in the region become Iran and Syria. Suddenly Syria is our new best friend, but it hasn't been historically, and it probably won't be in the future. Do we really want a weak Iraq and a strong Iran and a strong Syria? There are no quick or easy answers here. This is going to challenge all our statecraft as much as it has been challenged in the past 40 years.
Well, and King, thanks for being here this morning.
Great pleasure to be with you, Bruce. Thank you very much indeed, and I salute your callers. They ask very good questions.
We're going to continue taking calls with Mr. King. We're waiting for an opportunity to jump into our live coverage of the Foreign Policy Research Institute conference on Kuwait's plight and the future security of the Gulf. We'll be opening with a panel discussion called Background and Crisis Origins, and as soon as we're able to do that, we will. But in the meantime, Mr. King has consented to remain with us for a few more minutes as we continue to take calls for him. And as we wait for the next call, based on all the things that you've said so far this segment, I have to ask you, are you generally an optimist or a pessimist about the way things are going? And I mean the Gulf and energy and so forth.
I'm a very hard question to answer, Bruce. Some days I feel that human wisdom will prevail and we will do well, and some days I feel that there's a terrible calamitous inevitability about it. It depends on what I hear that's coming out of the Middle East. And none of us is privy to what our intelligence is telling us, except the President himself. My own deep hope is that the President will talk a little less and study a little harder and be convinced in his own mind, as our Commander-in-Chief must, of the correctness of his actions, and then explain them coherently and credibly to us. It is a function of our country that we do not attack the President on foreign policy issues. Our hearts and our minds are with him on foreign policy issues. But Mr. Bush has so far caused us to have some doubts about his own vision of where this goes. Yes, I'm an optimist because I think that there are other interests in the world that will affect our policy making constructively. I don't really think that the Western Europeans want war, although they've been most supportive of us. Hard to believe that Japan, a total energy importing country, wants a war. We must have, though, major concessions in any peace from Saddam Hussein. He must withdraw from Kuwait. Then there is the issue of an outlet, which one caller mentioned, to the Gulf, and an ocean outlet, which when the British created Kuwait, they denied to him because as a maritime power. They weren't denied to his predecessors because as a maritime power, the British had some very strong views about who had ports where. And remember that that part of Arabia was really chopped up by the British, as other parts were chopped up by the French and the British with the Sykes-Picot lines, etc. It seems to me quite reasonable, quite equitable, that Saddam should have an outlet to the Gulf, that it would be good for Arabia. You've also got to remember, although we are highly indignant about the invasion of Kuwait, the Kuwaiti government was less than stellar. We are not looking at the snuffing out of some great democracy. We're looking at a very spoiled, corrupt family that ran a country as its personal property. And it would seem to me quite reasonable to have an international conference after a withdrawal from Kuwait, from the principal areas of Kuwait, like Kuwait City, to have an international conference in which we played a secondary role to make decisions on on the contested oil field and on the islands.
Keeping in mind that we may have to interrupt this, we'll take another call from Miami, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Isn't it true that Saddam Hussein has a large biological weapons
Tell you what,
production?
caller, I'm afraid that I was a little too prescient and we really don't have time. Thanks again, Mr. King.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time. And now we join the Foreign Policy Research Institute discussion on Kuwait's plight and the future security of the Gulf.
The crisis's origins, and we have a panel of 3 participants and a moderator, and the moderator is Sheikh Abbas Abdullah. He was educated here in the United States, receiving his undergraduate and master's and PhD from Indiana University. He received his doctorate in 1973. He returned to Kuwait, where he pursued a career of distinguished scholarship and found time therein while pursuing that career to participate in a number of public enterprises in Kuwait and to take on assignments for his government. He became the Dean of Students of Kuwait University in 1976 and held that position until 1980. He then became the cultural counselor of the Embassy of Kuwait here in Washington from 1980 to 1987. From 1987 till 89, he was a visiting scholar at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins here in Washington. And in July 1990, he was named the chairman of the Department of Political Science at Kuwait University. He will moderate this panel, Sheikh Abbas Abdullah.
Mr. Chairman, Your Excellency. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this fine introduction. My name is Sheikh Abbas Abdullah, and if I became the chairman of Political Science Department, it was not consummated by the Iraqi invasion. And I would like to thank the Institute for this timely and wonderful topic. But just let me briefly say a comment on what His Excellency has brought up. He mentioned Article 1 of the Constitution of Kuwait, and as a citizen of Kuwait, I would like to emphasize also Article 4 and Article 6, which they jointly emphasize the legitimacy of our constitutional emirate in Kuwait that we all the Kuwaitis have agreed upon many years ago, and that we emphasized in the Congress of the People in Jeddah in October 1990. It gives me an honor here to present our first speaker, Professor Eli Kaddouri, Professor of Politics, Emeritus University of London. Dr. Kaddouri is a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Studies. Dr. Kaddouri is the founder and the editor of the distinguished journal Middle East Study Association. So, Professor Kaddouri.
I am to talk today about Iraqi political culture. And the subject is important because one wants to find out how it is that suddenly brutal action of this kind was taken by one neighbor against another peaceable neighbor. Now, Iraqi political culture can be succinctly described as a culture of violence, and there is a history to this. And we have to keep this in mind, and if we do keep it in mind, we'll find it very helpful in explaining the course of events which began on the 2nd of August last, and the character of the invasion and the sequels of the invasion. Now, Iraq is constituted by 3 ex-Ottoman provinces which were made into a kingdom after the First World War, and the king who was established there by the British was the 3rd son of the Sharif of Mecca, who was an outsider, but he was brought in by the British government. And when he came in, he was accompanied by a great number of ex-Ottoman officers who had deserted, many of them, from the Ottoman army during the war and joined the Sharifian forces. Hence, they came to Iraq in the entourage of the king and became very important in the government of Iraq. Now, these officers learned their political lessons while serving in the Ottoman army, mostly as junior officers. And when they did desert, they were, in effect, most of them, quite junior officers. Their political experience as junior officers extends through the decade which preceded the outbreak of war in 1914. That decade was divided in the middle by a coup d'etat. The coup d'etat by the Young Turks in 1908, followed by another coup d'etat also by the Young Turks in 1909. This coup d'etat was organized by also Ottoman junior officers from Salonika in Macedonia, where they were stationed. It's very significant that they were stationed in Macedonia. Macedonia was then a lawless region which was sunk in violence. It was, one can't exaggerate too much in saying that it was a veritable snake pit in which many groups, including Greeks, Bulgars, Macedonians, as well as the Ottoman army, fought continuously a ferocious guerrilla war, each seeking mastery over the others and using all kinds of ways, violent ways, in order to gain this mastery. The first political lessons of the Young Turk officers who organized the coup d'etat were learned in this very violent region. The Young Turk regime, which followed the coup d'etat of 1908-9, put these junior officers in power. And the Young Turk regime from 1909 until 1914, the outbreak of war, the history of it is of quarrels, of intrigues, of factions, of political assassinations. There is a most striking accident which happened in 1913 when Enver, who later on became the virtual dictator of the Ottoman Empire and ran the war, in which he was defeated together with the empire, Enver burst into the Sublime Porte while the cabinet was sitting in 1913 at the head of a group of armed men, one of whom killed the Minister of War. Now, the Arab contemporaries of these violent and conspiratorial officers imbibed the lessons of what they saw around them, lessons in the acquisition and the use of power. And this is clearly seen in their style of government after Iraq attained full independence in 1932. The history of Iraqi politics after 1932 is of a succession of governments, most of them violently overthrown, either by Baghdad-instigated rebellions in the tribal areas, usually in the Euphrates, or by military coup d'etat. The first of these coup d'etat took place in 1936, and the last one in 1968 brought the Ba'ath Party to power. What was the character of this Iraqi state? Half of the inhabitants were Shiites, a fifth or so were Kurds. The Shiites and the Kurds were generally nomadic, or semi-settled groupings who were unaccustomed to bend their necks to the yoke of a central government. Now, this is equally true of the Sunni tribes, to one of which Saddam Hussein belongs. Tribal life was and is violent. There is no common authority, and the tribes constantly warred against one another. And Saddam would have been very familiar with this violent society and its ways. There are stories, some of them quoted indeed in authorized biographies of the ruler of Iraq, which say that he was given a revolver at the tender age of 7 and that he killed somebody at the age of 10. Whether this is true or not, such stories are pointers to the norms which obtained in this nomadic or semi-nomadic society. This being the character of the state, the government in Baghdad was very insecure all the time, and still is very insecure, for different reasons from what had obtained before the destruction of the monarchy in 1958. It was continuously threatened. Whoever held power continuously threatened by rivals and by populations which did not recognize the legitimacy of the regime. The Kurds and the Shiites, I have said, were the overwhelming majority, and they had standing grievances against a regime which they looked upon as a British-installed engine of oppression. Now, there was nobody in Baghdad who could speak for these populations, that they were at the mercy of a government which pursued its own purposes and not really paid any attention to the welfare of the population. The government was Arab Sunni, and they believed, therefore, that it had to be hostile to them. The Sunni rulers were an infinitesimal minority within the Arab Sunni minority in Iraq. A British observer who wrote at the end of the 1920s said in a private letter that he thought that there were no more than 200 or 300 people who were the actual government, who controlled everything and had all the power in their hands in that kingdom. And these people, moreover, had been virtually unknown before the British installed them in power. They had no position in the country before then, and they were very fearful, continuously fearful of challenges to their legitimacy. The government, therefore, we must conclude, was based on mutual fear and hatred between rulers and ruled. And this gave rise to what might be called trigger happiness. If I do not kill you, you will kill me, therefore I shoot first. There is another element to this violent political culture, and that relates to the ambitions of the Sharifian family. Faisal, who was king, was a Sharifian, belonged to the Sharifian family. His record was that he had been made into, he had been given Damascus by the British in the First World War, and he was proclaimed as a king of Syria in 1920 by his followers. And then he clashed with the French, and the French sent him away. But from the very beginning of his tenure of power in Iraq, Faisal and Iraqi policy, therefore, had an ingrained habit of looking for expansion beyond the frontiers of the kingdom. That Faisal and those who served under him were always looking towards Syria and other Arab countries in order to establish a union. Syria, he had served for a few months as king of Syria, but he always looked for ways in which that brief experience could be repeated. And therefore, we can say that from its very beginnings, and certainly after full independence was attained in 1932, Iraq pursued an activist foreign policy. And that activist foreign policy continued all through the life of the monarchy. The regent and then crown prince of Iraq, Abdullah, also continuously looked towards Syria to see whether some kind of unity could be effected, of course, with Iraq in the leading role. Also, the main figures in the 1930s and 40s, and indeed 50s in Iraqi politics, were also very much involved in this activist and expansionist policy. Yassin Hashemi, who came with Faisal, an officer, an ex-Ottoman officer, Nouri Said, who came with Faisal. They were all involved in this rather activist, restless activist foreign policy. Syria, they were always trying to gain supporters in Syria, an Iraqi party in Syria. Palestine too, Yassin sent arms and officers to fight in the Palestine rebellion in 1936. And this activist policy continued until the end. And indeed, the activist policy didn't concern only Syria or Palestine, but also concerned Kuwait, where there were attempts, short-lived attempts, once in 1938 and once in 1961, actually to come and invade Kuwait, which were stopped. There's another element in this culture of violence, and that is the ideology of pan-Arabism, which arose in a very serious manner in Baghdad in the 1930s. And what the Iraqi pan-Arabs dreamt of, looked for, was a union of all the Arabs under the aegis of Iraq. Iraq, which, as used to be said in the 1930s, would be the Prussia or the Piedmont of a united Arab state. And this particular expansionist ideology was inflamed by the very popular Nazi example in the 1930s. This ideology and the activism connected with it culminated in the events of 1941, when there was a rebellion, a military coup d'etat and a rebellion. There was, in 1941, on the part of those who carried out the coup d'etat, hope of German help in order to realize Arab unity. This was defeated by the British in short order, and the authors of the coup d'etat were caught and hanged. And you might say that the coup d'etat of 1958, which toppled the monarchy, was a revenge of the officers for the affair of 1941, and that the mutilation of the Crown Prince, the mutilation of the corpse of the Crown Prince in July 1958 was really the symbol of that revenge. There was a succession, as you know, of coups, military coups after 1958 for a whole decade, which culminated in Ba'athist rule. And Ba'athist rule, as we know, affects as a general practice, terrorism against their own people. Terrorism by a very small number of conspirators, both in 1963, when there was a very small interlude of Ba'athist rule, and after 1968, a terrorism which had never been seen before in Iraq. And after 1968, this terrorism was perfected by the establishment of networks of security organization and of the Ba'ath Party as a mechanism of control. Saddam Hussein was from the beginning, from 1968, a pillar of this regime which has perfected this terrorism, this violent way of ruling. And he became its master in 1979. The regime, therefore, was based on violence, and this violence is the culmination of a long tradition. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have spoken.
Thank you, Professor Keduri. Now to Dr. John Anthony. Dr. John Anthony is the President of the Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, and he serves as the President of Society for Gulf Arab Studies. He is also a consultant to the Department of Defense, State, and Treasury, and also he is an adjunct professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Defense College. Dr. Anthony.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. My colleague, Dr. Melroy, and myself will be dealing with background and contextual issues with regard to why certain things didn't happen prior to August the 2nd. There are many ways to go at this particular analysis. The use of history is essential in this regard because there are claims and counterclaims, there's misinformation and there's disinformation. Also an awareness of the structure of the governments of the protagonist, in particular Iraq, as Professor Kaduri has given us the background and evolution of, is as crucial as a knowledge of history and the nature and orientation of that government's positions, its policies, its actions, and its attitudes on questions of regional and global affairs. It's also in the context of the Iran-Iraq war and the unfinished business there following after the ceasefire and outstanding issues on the table that were being discussed, debated, deliberated, if not also mediated and negotiated. And the preoccupation by Iraq during that decade-long era with Iran and with ingratiating itself to its neighbors to the south, the other Gulf Arab countries, particularly the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and most especially in that context, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. It has also to do with the fact that the previous multinational force that came to the region for the reflagging scheme or the ship protection scheme precluded even the remotest thought of such a scenario, as well as the United Nations remaining seized with the dilemmas of this particular conflict throughout that period. Now, of course, many of these were taken off the table prior to August the 2nd, but in terms of understanding the background, the context, and some of the relevant perspectives, one must not lose sight of them, particularly in terms of regional geopolitical realities. In other words, in the earlier claims, let's just say the 1961 claim, or those in the 70s, and those voiced again in the 1980s, were absent the following that are present at the current time. Then, for example, Jordan, a key neighboring state and an additional outlet for Iraq's exports, was not on board. Then, Yemen, a key player on the other side of the Gulf and Peninsula, on the south side of the GCC and Saudi Arabia in particular, and under a different government, was not on board. Then the PLO, despite a growing demographic presence in Kuwait itself and a mounting political significant role in the region beyond Kuwait, was not on board. Then Iran, an immensely powerful neighbor to the east of Iran and also under a different government, was not on board. In 1990, however, with each of the three Arab players on board and the military might of Iran substantially weakened, the situation for such a move was far riper than it had ever been before. Not ripe enough to guarantee success, but certainly ripe enough to embolden such adventurism as occurred with perhaps the prospects of ultimate success. Now, in terms of elaborating on a dimension of what Sheikh Saud, the Kuwaiti ambassador, focused on, having to do with claims and counterclaims, perhaps the most disputed and specious of the claims, leaving aside oil, leaving aside the islands, leaving aside the questions of dividing rich from poor or the question of the legitimacy of various regimes in the area, is the claim that was given as the second rationale for the invasion, aggression, occupation, and annexation of Kuwait, namely that the Kuwaiti polity rightfully, historically, legitimately belonged to Iraq, and the claim being based on historical issues and legal notions and international relations of the 18th and 19th century. The response to this claim, the claim, I believe, being acknowledged by many otherwise innocent and unsuspecting Americans and other Westerners who are not students, scholars, and specialists on the subject, would at least include the following, which has been sorely reported or underreported in the media, that in accordance to Arab traditions, oral traditions of the region, the earliest known tribe to have settled in what is now Kuwait was the Bani Khalid, which was not at all or had ever been from Iraq, but rather from Eastern Arabia. And about 250 years ago, the Bani Khalid was displaced by the Utub, which also was not from Iraq, but rather from the northern and central Arabian Peninsula plateaus. And it was of that tribe that the clan of the Al-Sabah belonged and implanted their roots in rule and reign in Kuwait from the 1750s, unbroken until the present time. The Al-Sabah at no time owed allegiance to the Ottoman Empire. With respect to the Ottoman connection as such, Iraq itself never placed a single governor in Kuwait, and neither did the Ottoman Empire place a single government in Kuwait. The Ottoman Empire itself never governed Kuwait. There was never a Turkish garrison. There was never an Iraqi garrison. There was never any regularity to any tax gathering. There was occasionally the flying by Kuwaiti vessels of the Turkish flag, but this was a flag of convenience, inasmuch as the Kuwaiti flag was not recognized in all international ports. The Ottoman Empire, in short, never exercised sovereignty over Kuwait. At best, and only for limited times at that, a measure of suzerainty, and much of that on assumption and pretension as on actual occupation and factual claim. In practice, in short, the Ottoman Empire relations with Kuwait. With respect to these kinds of arguments, that even if Iraq's claims were to be arguable in a court and to be considered on their merits, extension of the rationale, the justification, and the logic would extend to the situation where present-day Turkey would have an even fairer claim to present-day Iraq. Present-day Syria would have an even fairer claim to present-day Lebanon. Present-day Morocco and Mauritania would have at least a fighting chance to be given a fair hearing with respect to Spain and Portugal, and Mexico likewise to the state of Texas. It makes as much sense, in other words, to say that Iraq rightly inherited or ought to have inherited Kuwait, as it would make sense to say that Iraq would rightly and ought to have inherited the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where 120 years ago there was indeed a Turkish force that invaded and occupied the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. But by contrast, there was no such Turkish or Ottoman force or Iraqi force that ever invaded and occupied Kuwait. Kuwait was not part of Iraq when Iraq obtained its first modern national government in 1921, or as Sheikh Saud pointed out, when Iraq joined the League of Nations in 1932. The Arab League, for which Iraq is a founding member, rejected Iraq's 1961 claim. And in 1963, the Iraqi government renounced its claim to Iraq, and the UN made Kuwait a member in 1963. Now, one could ask, in summing up here, why bring all of this up? You bring it up in part to show that the situation prior to the recent months leading up to August the 2nd were certainly less than propitious at the regional level. One brings it up in order to focus on the fact that the claims are legally and historically specious. One brings it up because the previous era leading up into it was one in which the regional and global environment was one that would have concluded that any such move would have been politically and morally audacious. One brings it up additionally to say that it is incorrect to say that Iraq or the Ottoman Empire governed Kuwait. And one brings it up as well to say that it is incorrect to suggest that Kuwait was nothing more than a British creation. And one brings it up further to underscore that it is incorrect to even imply that there was not an identifiable Kuwaiti entity, autonomous, prior to the interest shown in it by the British, by the Turks, and by the Iraqis. Now, to be sure, there will be additional reasons that my colleague, I presume, will be addressing, having to do, or others during the course of this seminar, having to do with oil, having to do with islands, having to do with the rich and the poor issues, and the question of legitimacy of various kinds of regimes. And each of these, to be sure, ought to be examined and given due consideration on their merit, to put them under the microscope to see whether they hold water. But to use such arguments in support of justifying an invasion of a neighboring country that was recognized, and a fellow member of the Arab League and a fellow member of the United Nations, both of organizations Iraq having been a founding member of, and to use such arguments in support of the ongoing occupation and annexation of Kuwait, in the process of scorning the resolutions of both the Arab League and the United Nations, and in violation of the Arab League Treaty of the mid-1950s against aggression by one Arab country of another, is, one can submit, merely a ruse, a guise, a pretext, a cooked-up rationale, a fake justification for an unacceptable act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor John Duke Anthony. Now, our final speaker is Laurie Milroy. She's a Bradley Foundation Fellow, Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard University, formerly an Assistant Professor of Government at Harvard University. Ms. Milroy is the co-author of a very fine recent work, which is titled Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Gulf. Although the topic is not very much exciting, but that book I recommend to be a Christmas gift you send to your friends. Indeed, I did that. I have the pleasure to ask Dr. Milroy to address this distinguished group. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah, for that very kind introduction. It's commonly said that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait is the result of Iraq's strength and Saddam's ambition. That's the image Baghdad wants to project, but I'd like to suggest something else. That what drives Saddam Hussein is above all weakness, or a peculiar combination of strength and weakness. Iraq's strength is, of course, its military power developed during the course of the war with Iran. But its weakness, its political system, which Professor Kaddouri described so well. The political system under Saddam Hussein is far weaker than under the monarchy, because Saddam Hussein is a conspirator who sees power in the dark of night. The war with Iran has intensified Saddam Hussein's problems in ruling Iraq, or at least the ceasefire to the war. Contrary to the regime's claim of victory, there was no victory with Iran. The war ended inconclusively. Iraq may have claimed the Shatt al-Arab, but it didn't control it. The river was closed. And even if Iraq had the Shatt al-Arab, would that have justified 8 years of war? Yet this inconclusive outcome was tolerated in Iraq. Even among the Shia, there was not much support for Khomeini. The population in Iraq didn't focus so much on whether there were gains or no gains from the war, but what would come after the war, expectations about the Iraqi peace dividend. Those expectations focused on peace, prosperity, and what they called more democracy, essentially a loosening of the tightness of the regime. The regime knew about those popular expectations. Already in August '88, the month of the ceasefire, when the population is still partying in the streets, Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz told a group of visiting Arabs that there would either have to be political change in Iraq or there would be political turmoil. In November, Saddam even announced a new program of democracy for Iraq that was going to include freedom of speech and constitutional reform. And after that, there were even very limited steps in that direction, that program of democracy which Saddam announced. Now, the cynical interpretation of this program of democracy, is that Saddam was simply playing for time. He knew that his political base in Iraq was too narrow to admit even minor political reforms, and he was waiting till such point where he could take other action to resolve his dilemma, namely action against Kuwait. That's a cynical interpretation. The perhaps naive interpretation is that after the ceasefire with Iran, Saddam Hussein stuck his toe in the waters of political reform and didn't like it. In any event, there was no political reform, despite popular expectations and the regime's promises, and that, along with the economic situation that continued to deteriorate, led to the invasion. Now, obviously, plans existed for some time for Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Maybe the Iraqi army always has had plans in the drawer for invading Kuwait. But when did Saddam Hussein decide to act on those plans? The Egyptians say, soon after Iraq's war with Iran ended, that the February 1989 founding of the Arab Cooperation Council among Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, and Iraq was essentially the first step in this plot. Perhaps, I don't know. Another clue, perhaps more reliable, is provided by Iraq's posture toward Israel. If Saddam Hussein was going to deter Kuwait, going to invade Kuwait, he had to deter Israel. He had to make sure that Israel was not going to act in coordination with the United States in response to his invasion of Kuwait. Contrary to much misinformation, there was no particular hostility between Iraq and Israel at the time of the ceasefire to the Iran-Iraq war. Just an accustomed level of unfriendly rhetoric. The first time anything peculiar happened between those two countries was in July 1989, a year after the ceasefire. Then Iraq and Jordan jointly conducted reconnaissance flights over the Jordan River Valley aimed at getting targeting information about Israel. The Israelis saw it, they were puzzled by it, didn't know what it meant. They had no good explanation. But in retrospect, was that the first preliminary step in deterring Israel and preparing for the invasion of Kuwait? Khomeini had died the month before, June '89, and Khomeini, God rest his soul, was a man of principle. It's far less likely that he would have made the same deal that his successors did, that is to keep the border quiet in the east so that Iraq could swallow Kuwait. Did Khomeini's death facilitate Saddam's plans by offering hope of a stable frontier? Iraq's economic situation deteriorated in the period after the ceasefire steadily. By early 1990, Iraq wasn't even repaying its military debt, and France cut off arms supplies to Iraq because of non-payment. But the crucial event in precipitating the invasion of Kuwait seems to have been the collapse of the Eastern European governments, particularly the fall of Ceausescu just about a year ago. It seems that this happening in Eastern Europe made Saddam fearful about his own position because his regime was a lot like Ceausescu's. And he began to implement plans aimed at extorting huge sums of money from Kuwait. If Kuwait was not going to pay it, then he intended to take the country and its wealth. February 1990, at the Arab Cooperation Council summit in Jordan, Saddam warned the other Arab leaders there that he wasn't interested in having Iraq's wartime loans forgiven. He advised them, go tell those people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf that I need $30 billion in fresh money, and if they don't give it to me, I'm going to take it. That was in private. Between then and the 2nd of August, Kuwait became the focus of Iraqi pressure with demands for $10 billion repeatedly made by Iraq on Kuwait. And there was a public expression to Iraq's new strategy. It appeared in the tensions between Iraq and the West, which began at the same time. Because at that same summit, Saddam suddenly called for the liberation of Jerusalem, for U.S. ships to get out of the Persian Gulf, which he hadn't done before. There were a series then of Iraqi provocations, including the execution of the British-based journalist Farzad Bazoft and the threat to burn half of Israel. Saddam sought to raise tensions, to polish his nationalist credentials, intimidate Kuwait, and deter Israel. Saddam's war aims went beyond enforcing OPEC quotas, which Kuwait had already agreed to before the invasion, or enlarging Iraq's limited access to the Gulf. Iraq could have taken the territory north of Kuwait without precipitating a U.S. intervention. The American ambassador essentially told him so on the eve of the invasion when she said that the U.S. would not become involved in border disputes. Saddam apparently believed that by taking Kuwait City, he could get control of Kuwait's foreign assets. There are implications to this. Doesn't seem Saddam can rest easy at home. Kuwait hasn't solved his problem, and he seems bound to a course of perpetual hostility with his neighbors. It also suggests that the elements of deterrence that stabilize the superpower balance of power won't necessarily work with Iraq and its enemies, because Saddam's precarious domestic position leads him to take risks that more secure or less ruthless rulers would avoid.
You were immensely enjoying this talk, and I hate to be the bad guy, so I think we have time for a couple of questions. Wonderful. No questions? Sir.
Is this material going to be available to us?
I beg your pardon?
Is this material that is being presented going to be available to us?
Yes. Yes, it will be.
Sir.
I commend the Institute for an extraordinary panel. I think you have done much to illuminate some of the background to this saga that is very much in need of display before the American people. In particular, I think you have shed light on the root of the present Arab-Arab conflict. And I would like each of the panelists, if they could briefly, including the ambassador, if he would, to address one of the vexing questions to those of us who advocate action against Saddam Hussein in light of this background, which is that if the United States, either alone or in partnership with such allies as we have in the Gulf, were to strike at Saddam Hussein for the purposes of ending the reign of terror in Iraq and the threat of future aggression in the Gulf, this would precipitate a very dangerous and adverse reaction among Arabs to the United States. Could you address this point, please?
Thank you, Frank, for the very frank question again, which you put forward. I believe this argument has been a center for the Iraqi propaganda, which they have tried repeatedly to say that such an action would create hatred or some kind of violence between the Arabs and the United States and would be foreseen as a US-Arab kind of war. I know this argument has been advocated by them and by some of their agents in this country also, which I do not see personally this as a credible kind of argument, because we have a coalition of 28 nations, including Arab nations and Islamic nations, in line together with the Western Alliance. We have also nations who are not part of this coalition, or Islamic or Arab or Western Alliance. We have from South America, we have Czechoslovakia and other nations. So this baseless argument has been devised by the Iraqis in order to deter any kind of action. As far as we're concerned, the war started on the 2nd of August, and we have called upon our friends and allies around the world to deter this aggression and to reverse this aggression. It's an inherent right under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. So the argument to talk about this will create some kind of a situation of disarray between the Arab world and the United States is false and unfounded. Because whether they are in the Arab nations, Islamic nations, or allies, they are members of the United Nations with the task of securing international peace and security. And that's why the Security Council was created for this purpose. And that's why we have 5 permanent members of the Security Council and 10 non-permanent members. And that's why they have acted concurrently for this purpose. So every time we are talking about leaving regional crises for regional countries to resolve it, why have the United Nations? I don't see any reason why we have the United Nations or Security Council. Then we'll have small security councils in each area. We already have the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has pronounced itself unanimously in calling the foreign forces in. We also have the Arab Summit Conference that took place in Cairo, which authorized and approved Saudi Arabia's call to invite forces in the area to deter and to reverse aggression. So I don't really buy that argument by the Iraqis, which has been advocated by them and by their agents. So thank you.
I think we have to, if we're going to adhere to our schedule, take a break now. It'll be about a 10-minute break. And if you can have a cup of coffee or whatever and return here promptly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yellow pasty on my chest saying that Wilson Van Horst has.
You've been watching C-SPAN's live coverage of a Foreign Policy Research Institute conference titled Kuwait's Plight and the Future Security of the Persian Gulf. Right now, participants are taking a short break. Our live programming will continue when the conference reconvenes. And a programming note that Vice President Dan Quayle will deliver the keynote address later today. And C-SPAN will be live with his remarks starting at about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 10:30 a.m. Pacific.
To give our viewers a better understanding of the Persian Gulf crisis, C-SPAN recently asked Middle East analyst Christine Helms to give her insight on the key leaders in the Middle East.
What can you tell us about Saddam Hussein? He's a man who, well, he's 53 years old now. He was born in a more rural area north of Baghdad. He went to Baghdad, studied in high school, took part in an assassination attempt against Abdul Karim Qasim, who was known as the sole leader, who was a military dictator. The assassination attempt failed. Saddam escaped across the desert to Syria and eventually to Egypt, where he spent several years. He returned, having studied law, to Iraq, was arrested, spent several years in prison. During the time he was in prison, he remained active in politics, was elected to the national command of the Ba'ath Party, which is an Arab nationalist party. Escaped from jail in 1966, went into hiding for several years, and in 1968, when the Ba'ath Party took control of the government, arose and began to occupy a number of party positions concerning everything from diversifying arms purchases to dealing with farmers. He had a particular interest in farmers' rights, salination of soil, water resources. Eventually, of course, was an assistant to Bakr and took over the government in 1979 himself.
There is a sheikh who was in power in Kuwait prior to the Iraqis' arrival. Can you tell us about him?
Well, again, I don't know much about him as an individual, but what we can say is that this is a sheikhdom, as I described, an old family that has been there for centuries, was given protection by the British in the post-World War I period in a unique situation. They were the only protectorate given by the British in this mandated period of time. It was important for them to have it even then because the Iraqi Kuwaiti connection, shall we say, was very close. In the Ottoman Empire, before it dissolved, Kuwait was ruled by the Ottoman administrators in Basra. In fact, Kuwait at that time imported most of their fresh water by Dow to Kuwait because they had no fresh water, very few wells in the desert. And until they created desalination plants in the 50s and 60s, they were still dependent on Iraq for fresh water. And you would see the converse. You saw that many Kuwaiti sheikhs owned plantations, date palm plantations in Basra and southern Iraq, and there were a lot of economic trading ties between these two areas. Basically, because of this paucity of resources, very little water, of course, for that reason they import agricultural products, but tremendous oil. The Kuwaitis became an oil wealthy nation, and in subsequent years have diverted a lot of their oil wealth into investments. And it's believed they now make more money through investments than they actually do through their oil revenues. The Saudis have always played a much more conservative role in the Middle East. They have preferred not to provoke, not to be confrontational, to play a more behind-the-scenes role. They have been more active in recent years in hoping to resolve disputes. For example, their encouragement in rallying the Arabs to deal with Lebanon is perhaps the best example that I might mention most recently.
How old is King Fahd? Is he up in years?
I don't really think he's very old. I think one has an image of him being old simply because he's been sick and ill. And the last two times that he's canceled his visit here to the States was precisely because people assumed that, in fact, it was stated, I believe, by the Saudi government itself that, he was too ill to make the trip. But I don't believe he's that old. I would say, I think in his late 60s.
And the two countries I want to go to next. Let's start with Jordan and King Hussein, who is a familiar figure here in the United States.
Well, his family is perhaps one of the holiest, if I can use that term, families in the Middle East. His relatives were the families entrusted with the keeping of the Haramain, the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Of all families, he can probably claim the heritage to being the closest to the Prophet's family. His family has had a long and distinguished history, played a role throughout the last several centuries, many important political roles with the British themselves. And as we know, during this century, he has become one of the longest reigning monarchs. He's has been renowned for keeping an open mind, for listening to all parties, for trying to use patience and a clear head to get through to the end. I think he's a man who right now is incredibly tired and frustrated, not over dealing with the Israeli problem, but the Iran-Iraq war. And certainly we've seen evidence of his frustration in very recent days.
President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt.
Well, this is the one country where one can say, yes, the military took over, and mainly they have had military leaders in the guise of civilians ever since. They do have a parliament, but it is a highly controlled political government, just like the others. It's a country that has been the most open to the West, and if you travel to Egypt, you will see nightclubs and bars and restaurants, and it's a very active city till the early hours of the morning. They have depended increasingly upon U.S. subsidies and foreign aid in recent years. They have very serious economic problems and are facing a population growth rate of 1 million people being added to their country every 8 months. So that, and they probably will become an energy importer within the next 2 or 3 years, not an energy exporter. And there is some talk, too, that they may have serious water problems, not even be able to supply the city of Cairo within the next year or two.
Syria.
Syria is the ultimate example right now of a military regime. It is run by Hafez al-Assad. It is a Ba'ath party, but unlike the Ba'ath party in Iraq, which is civilian in orientation, the Ba'ath party in Syria is controlled by the Alawites, who are military officers, or by, I should say, military officers who happen to be Alawite. And once again, we see serious economic problems in Syria with water and electricity being cut off, sometimes for as much as 14 hours a day. The oil from Iraq through Syria was stopped in the early 80s. Syria has been dependent upon oil shipments from Iran. They have been diverted by the problems in Lebanon, and they have a large element of their army stationed in Lebanon now. So once again, we see many problems for the future here with this country.
Up next, we resume our live coverage of a Foreign Policy Research Institute conference titled Kuwait's Plight and the Future Security of the Persian Gulf. The panel ahead is titled Kuwait's Plight, Occupation, Resistance, and Exile. The discussion is moderated by Hassan al-Ibrahim from Citizens for a Free Kuwait. Also taking part are Andrew Whitley of the Middle East Watch, Patrick Clausen from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and Anthony Cortisman, who's with the Office of Republican Senator John McCain of Arizona. Once again, later today, Vice President Dan Quayle will deliver the keynote address to the conference, and C-SPAN will carry his comments live at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 10:30 a.m. Pacific.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel is on the occupation, resistance, and exile, Kuwait's plight. I feel that we've moved at a fairly draconian pace, and we have a lot to say amongst the panelists, and I think that maybe questions are going to be slighted. At 2:15, after the Vice President's remarks, there will be a press conference and open forum here in this room. And to the extent that we haven't had an opportunity to deal at any length with the questions, I hope you'll feel welcome to stay and ask the questions at that time. The moderator of this panel is Hassan al-Ibrahim. He too received his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate from the University of Indiana. His doctorate in 1971. He returned to an academic and administrative career in Kuwait. He was an associate professor of political science at Kuwait University in 1975. He was a scholar in residence at Georgetown in 1980 and 81. He was the dean of the College of Commerce, Economics, and Political Science at Kuwait University from 72 to 75. He was the rector of Kuwait University from 1975 to 1980. He is widely published. He has provided a number of services to his country. He was the attaché to the permanent mission of the state of Kuwait to the United Nations in 1966. And he is now chairman of the board of the Kuwait Society for the Advancement of Arab Children. Dr. Hassan al-Ibrahim.
Well, welcome to the second session. I was asked to be ruthless as far as the time is concerned. We have to finish this session at 11:15. If there is any other questions, of course, as Mr. Christie mentioned, we will have enough time after the speech of the Vice President. In the first session, I calculated the minutes that my colleague, Dr. Abdullah, wasted in coming here to the podium and introducing the speakers. So it was about 8 minutes. I'm going to cut that. So our speakers today, Mr. Andrew Whitley, Executive Director, Middle East Watch, and his topic is the human right catastrophe. I have a name in my list for Samira Al-Khayyat, which I don't see her on the table here. So I assume that she is not here. And then we have Samira Al-Khayyat is eyewitness, and her topic will be what I saw. Mr. Patrick Clausen, editor of Orbs, and his topic will be putting Kuwait back together. Mr. Anthony Kozman, a legislative assistant to Senator McCain, and his topic will be what war will mean to Kuwait. So allow me to introduce Mr. Andrew Whitley.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're on a strict time schedule, and so I will do my best to preserve that. I feel that in some ways I've been given the easiest and in some ways possibly the most difficult task. Many of you feel that on the subject of human rights abuses in Kuwait, you've all been reading the papers and watching television, you think you know the subject all already. And secondly, I'm going to be followed to this podium by a real-life eyewitness whose credibility I certainly would not deign to impugn. So our task is to try to demonstrate what we as an organization, what Middle East Watch has attempted to document over the 3.5 months since the invasion, 4.5 months now, excuse me. And we have been following it very closely indeed. We've, within our resources, been attempting to follow it from refugees who've recently arrived from the country. Let me, by way of introduction, try and explain some of the problems that we have in trying to go about doing this research and producing it in a systematic fashion. We are dealing with a highly emotional subject on which many charges have been bandied around. Many of those charges are indeed fully justified. Others are perhaps not. They might be a little exaggerated. And it's part of our duty as a human rights organization concerned with documenting and seeking redress of those abuses to try to put things in context and to press the guilty parties where guilt is established. But in order to be able to illustrate the problems of documentation in the present climate, a climate which occasionally verges on the near hysterical, let me refer to two particular case instances which we attempted to examine fairly closely. These are the charges of systematic rapes in Kuwait and of babies being torn from incubators to be allowed to die while the incubators themselves were trucked off to Baghdad. When charges like that are being made, it's really hard to make one's own voice heard above the hullabaloo. Yes, indeed, we have been able to determine that the infant mortality rate in Kuwait has shot up from approximately 75 deaths per thousand prior to the invasion to about 136 per thousand in the first 2 months of the crisis. Yes, indeed, Kuwaiti citizens have been turned away from hospitals on a systematic and regular basis. And yes, there has been a wholesale looting of equipment from Kuwait, including hospital equipment. Those abuses are bad enough, ladies and gentlemen, without needing further exaggeration. But in this case, 2 and 2 do not necessarily add up to 4. We have no proof that from Kuwait's 2 main maternity hospitals, the Al-Sabah and the Hadi hospital, that incubators were stolen. Indeed, we've spoken to many doctors who have been involved from those hospitals who believe that perhaps the accounts were mistaken. You ask then, how was that increase in infant mortality arrived at? Probably it was due to a combination of factors: stress on pregnant women, lack of medicines, and a lack of trained medical personnel. It's worth noting that some 90% of the medical personnel, doctors and nurses, were foreign. Many of them fled in the first few weeks or stayed at home and then escaped. A number of factors could account for this, and indeed, perhaps that statistic was a fluke, perhaps it was an erratic one. We're all playing with numbers. And the same problem applies to the charges of changing of Kuwait's ethnic identity. The population of native Kuwaitis in their own country at the present time, we estimate is probably down to about 200,000 from an estimated 750 to 800,000 before the crisis, i.e. about a quarter of the population. Add to that another 200 to 250,000 or so Palestinians, Indians, Sri Lankans and others who are still there, together with a huge Iraqi army of over 300,000 actually in the state as opposed to in the neighboring parts of Iraq. But apart from a handful of Palestinian fighters and a small number of Iraqi families who moved after the invasion, we have no record of a population transfer having taken place. Saddam may well be thinking of doing so. After all, he's ordered all Kuwaitis to take Iraqi IDs. There have been rumors that young males may be subject to an Iraqi military call-up, and there have been attempts to destroy Interior Ministry records. All this adds up to an intention, but it does not mean that there has been an influx of Iraqi civilians, as has been alleged. On the contrary, last month an official order called on all Iraqi civilians who had gone to Kuwait to return. Not the least of the reasons for this order are practical ones. The new military authorities cannot guarantee the safety of isolated Iraqi families living among Kuwaitis. And secondly, there are indeed severe food shortages for all residents, and indeed the army itself, from our evidence, appears to be going hungry at times. There were many people, ladies and gentlemen, including many shocked fellow Arabs, who were dismayed by the charges about the behavior of the Iraqi government. But this came as no surprise to those of us who had been following the record of Saddam Hussein over the years, and our organization published a report in February whose accounts of the behavior and the methods that the Mukhabarat, the Iraqi secret police, and the military intelligence maintained towards their own population is entirely consistent with the practices that we are seeing towards Kuwait. Indeed, the practices towards the suppression of Iraqi Kurdistan in 1988 has indeed been repeated today in Kuwait in 1990. Let me very briefly tell you, before you charge me with not having examined certain issues, what issues we regard as being outside our mandate. Middle East Watch is a strictly apolitical organization, and it takes no position on the issues of Iraq's claim to Kuwait, just as it does on the position of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We stay out of those matters. The basis of our interventions are primarily, but not exclusively, international humanitarian and human rights law. These are the International Covenant on Civil and Political rights, the Geneva Conventions, and the UN Human Rights Declaration. We examine a country's own constitution, its legal code, and its internationally treaty obligations. And we seek to uphold the internationally agreed rules of war. The 1949 Geneva Conventions are the primary document in this case. And of course, while we endorse democracy as the best expression of individual political liberty, we do not seek to tell a country what system of government it should have. Thus, in the case of Kuwait, we do not join in the debate over whether or not the al-Sabahs should be restored. One could argue, indeed, as many have done, that they have a degree of popular legitimacy already. But we feel that perhaps it would be more appropriate for the United States, in the course of restoring Kuwait's legitimate government, to endorse that country's own pro-democracy movement, which had been gathering ahead of steam earlier this year. Although the administration will not speak of it now for tactical reasons, in the battle to reverse Saddam Hussein's action, it's not unreasonable for the US to press the al-Sabahs to fully implement the 1962 Constitution and perhaps to go further and broaden the franchise after the restoration. Let me turn perhaps now to the issues of the phases of the occupation and how we have identified the problems which have occurred during the period from August the 2nd. There were 4 phases. The first one was the invasion phase, the first 3 days of August the 2nd to the 5th. Our rough estimate is that in that period, perhaps 300 people may have died in combat against Republican Guards or else were shot on being captured. Neither the government in exile nor the Iraqis have given a proper accounting of those confused first days. The second period I would call the phase of consolidating control. It ran from about August the 5th to the end of the month. During that period, the Iraqi army engaged in large-scale looting and misappropriation of public and private property. There was some limited action by Army Command to curb the problem. Booty, as you all know, was shipped directly back to Iraq. There were scattered rapes of foreign women, refugees were robbed, and thousands of foreigners were prevented from leaving the country. I shall not elaborate on that matter. Kuwaitis themselves set up self-help local committees, peaceful demonstrations were crushed, and there were a number of dead from those instances. But this is a phase of relative benign action, relative. The period of armed resistance, September to October, is the toughest one. That's the one which you've been hearing most of the abuses about. This is the period in which guerrilla activity in parts of Kuwait City became a nuisance to the Iraqis. They were already put out by their failure to find any collaborators to lend legitimacy to the puppet government. As a result, they cracked down, and their arrival of the Muhabarat and of the former Minister of Local Government, who had been responsible for the pacification of Kurdistan, was what really triggered this whole-scale action. During this period, I shall not elaborate on the disputes, on the abuses. You're well aware of them all. There were perhaps scores, indeed hundreds, of arbitrary executions. We believe that a realistic figure of the arbitrary executions might be 600 to 700. In itself, that is a dreadful figure. Keep it in proportion that it's primarily Kuwaitis who were targeted during that time, not the non-Kuwaiti population. And as a proportion of the male population left in the country, it is indeed shocking. There was torture in makeshift interrogation centers. We have plenty of evidence of that. Widespread arrests, our own view is that perhaps the number of arrests in total has been 5,000 to 6,000. We believe that possibly 3,000 are still in detention today. Many people are still being arrested, others are being released, and the overall numbers are possibly constant. My time is running short, and I shall not run through all the details of the punishments that have been taken place. Now, I'll come to a close by saying that in the latest period, from November onwards, there have been sporadic attempts by the Iraqi military authorities to curb the freelance abuses by soldiers. There's been a decline in the number of executions. We believe that they are still taking place, but on a less regular and a less systematic basis than before. There certainly has been no attempt to improve access to detainees. The hospitals and the university have now been taken over completely by Iraqis. And in conclusion, I would like to say that whereas many have said that the international order is at stake over this act of naked aggression, and indeed Saddam Hussein should not be allowed to get away with that, equally at stake is respect for international law. And I believe that the basis for the new world order, which we all strive for in this new era, should also be based on prescribing the respect by Saddam Hussein and his regime for those international conventions. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Whitley. I promise that I want to introduce each speaker by, introduce all of them together in the beginning of this panel to save time. But I would like to bring to the attention of Mr. Whitley that the Kuwaiti People Congress on the 13th and 15th of October was totally committed, the Kuwaiti government, the ruling family, and the people of Kuwait, to the 1962 Constitution. There is no need for any pressure from the US or any other countries. Kuwait is a democratic country, and we are totally committed to that Constitution. Samira Al-Hayat, please.
What I saw during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. When I was in Kuwait during the first 6 weeks of the invasion, we used. Thank you. When I was in Kuwait during the first 6 weeks of the invasion, we used to live in pain and fear of the Iraqis' brutality and aggression. Join me for a few minutes in remembering some of those nightmare stories which I experienced during that period. The first day of the invasion, on August 2nd, Iraqi soldiers were shooting randomly at anyone in the streets. Hundreds of people were killed and wounded. I saw people leaving their cars in the middle of the road and running for their lives while the Iraqis stole their cars. One of my relatives was shot on the head and was left to death in front of his house. He had stormed out to investigate what was happening. Another relative found his brother, who had been missing for weeks, in a pool of blood in front of his house while he was going to pray Al-Fajr prayer. As I was leaving our house with my mother, I saw 3 Iraqi trucks filled with soldiers and a red jeep stopped in front of our neighbor's house. They pulled our neighbor's son, who was in his early 20s, from the red jeep, shooting him in view of his mother, father, and some neighbors. The soldiers even refused the mother's plea to see her son's eyes and talk to him one last time before they shoot him. A friend of my brother used to collect the trash from the streets in helping to maintain the country clean during the invasion, was taken by Iraqi soldiers and released 10 days later, now deaf, as both of his eardrum had been broken. One of my friend's relatives was driving his car with his 4-year-old daughter. Iraqi soldiers stopped him and demanded they be taken for a ride. As he refused their demand, they shot him. The same bullet reached his daughter, killing her on the spot. I will never forget that night. It was Monday, September 10, about 11:30 p.m. in Al-Roda city. We heard the sound of shots nearby, lasting about 10 seconds. In the morning, on my way out, I saw many cars in the parking area of Al-Bayadir Salam Society, now an Iraqi station. After some inquiries, we realized that the shoots from the previous night involved the shooting of about 24 young Kuwaiti men who were in their diwaniyah, which is a social gathering for men at night, because they refused to hang Saddam's picture. The cars I saw in the parking lot belonged to the victims, for after they were killed, the Iraqis stole their cars. I saw my friend's body full of bruises by the Iraqi soldiers because she refused to walk on our Amir's picture. Iraqi soldiers, in a rage of anger, burned 12 Kuwaiti houses around a school in Al-Roda city after discovering the bodies of some Iraqi soldiers in that school. By the time I left Kuwait on September 12, more than 25 houses had been burned. I went to the National Scientific and Technical Information Center, KISR, at Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research to get some important document from my office. The library was almost destroyed, empty of all the equipments we used to have: computers, typewriters, microfilm reader printer, and photocopying machines. Even half of the shelves were empty of books. In my way out, I saw Iraqi trucks filled with all the stolen goods. The third week of the invasion, I took my mother to Mubarak al-Kabir Hospital, which is now Al-Fida al-Am, they changed the name, for her regular checkup and to get some medicine. She usually gets medicine for 2 months, but this time she got a supply for only 10 days. I also took my daughter, 5 months, to the same hospital. Unfortunately, I couldn't find one pediatrician to give her the right medicine. Iraqi soldiers used to break into the houses at any time, during the day or night, looking for Kuwaiti army soldiers who were believed to have joined the Kuwaiti resistance or possesses any weapons. I was awakened one morning about 5:30 a.m. by shots being fired nearby. I looked out the window. I saw more than 30 Iraqi soldiers in our neighbor's house, searching their garden. On their way out, they took our neighbor's son. When we asked the boy's mother, she said, with tears in her eyes, that the soldiers had asked about one of her sons who is in Kuwait Army. When she told them that he was not in Kuwait during the invasion, they did not believe her, therefore taking his brother captive until she would tell them where her other son was hiding. I saw Iraqi soldiers burning Bayan Public Library books to fix their tea in the streets at the checking point. Saddam Hussein might already destroyed Kuwait physically, but he is tortured by the notion that Kuwait flag still proudly rises on the United Nations, Arab League, Gulf Cooperation Council, and other international organization buildings. We are back, inshallah, if God wills it.
We definitely will be back, Samira, I assure you of that. Allow me just to read a paragraph of a fax that I received this morning from a recently released British hostage. He said his personal experience was of the execution of 2 teenagers, which took place almost opposite of the house in which I was hiding. I heard the 2 shots and the screams of the family, who had been forced to witness the shooting. I learned later that one of the boys had had a letter in his pocket addressed to President Bush asking him to free Kuwait. I then saw 2 men dressed in a dishdasha leaving the area carrying automatic handguns. For simple letters, 2 boys, age 14, were shot by the Iraqis. And I hope the Middle East Watch will take this note. Mr. Patrick Clausen, please.
The incredible destruction wrought by the Iraqi occupation surely must make living in Kuwait less attractive.
Furthermore, many Kuwaitis could easily live abroad. They have enough money. They often have sizable personal investments abroad. Indeed, some observers expected that Kuwait would become the first country in exile, with its citizens and its assets both divorced from the physical territory of Kuwait. Frankly, I had assumed that many well-to-do Kuwaitis would settle into an exile existence, much as did the 500,000 Iranians who fled from the Islamic Revolution. After all, life in the West End of London has many charms not available in Kuwait, and bad as the English climate may be, I personally prefer to that of the Gulf. The Kuwaitis, however, have surprised me. Instead of settling in abroad, the Kuwaitis in exile have bent all their energies towards returning to their native land. As the leader of the democratic movement put it, they want to go back even if the country has been leveled down to the sand. We have learned in this crisis that the Kuwaitis have a strong love of country. Kuwait may seem like a hot, barren, and uninviting desert to us, but to the Kuwaitis, it is the home that they value dearly. Because of the dedication of its people, Kuwait's prospects for reconstruction are bright. After the Iraqi forces leave, Kuwait will have its most vital assets, its people and its oil in the ground. These resources are more important than the buildings and other physical infrastructure that will have been destroyed. However, let me focus for a moment on the question of who should pay for rebuilding the destroyed assets. Kuwait by itself would certainly have the necessary money, but Kuwait would also have a good moral claim for aid from the international community, and most especially for reparations from Iraq. Iraq is a country rich in natural resources. It could afford to pay reparations if it had political leaders who let the economy breathe instead of suffocating any independent business activity as Saddam has. Let me offer a simple way to collect reparations. There would be a poetic justice if Iraq were forced to hand over to Kuwait as reparations the production of the Rumaila oil field, which straddles the Iraq-Kuwait border. Rather than rewarding Saddam's aggression by letting him keep that field, how much more just to say that the only fruits of aggression are ashes, namely the loss of income from the entire field. Kuwait has been and will be a rich country. That has led some observers to the misguided conclusion that Kuwait should pay a large share of the cost of the U.S. military deployment. Surely it is inappropriate to expect the victim to be the first to pay for the rescue. We should not ask Kuwait to make large additional contributions to the Gulf force. Instead, we should address ourselves to the aggressor, that is Saddam, and to those who have made a windfall gain off the events. The largest windfalls have been for Saudi Arabia and for Abu Dhabi. Now that its oil production is up to 8 million barrels a day, Saudi Arabia makes at least $3 billion a month extra thanks to the Saddam effect. Abu Dhabi pulls in at least $1 billion a month. The Saudis have lived up to their responsibilities. They have actually pledged to date more in contributions than they have collected in windfall. But Abu Dhabi has been lying low and avoiding publicity. If we feel that we need more contributions from those in the region, let us address our demands to Abu Dhabi, not to Kuwait. Much of the windfall for Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi have come from ignoring the old OPEC quotas. Those quotas are pernicious politically and economically. The quotas are an invitation to a bully like Saddam to act as an enforcer. As for the economics, the quotas are a blatant effort to monopolize the market and to jack up prices artificially. Fortunately, the quotas are rarely effective. It is, however, discouraging to hear some U.S. pundits and politicians decrying the evasion of the quotas as if this were some crime. Our policy should be to discourage cartels and to promote competition, which means we should applaud those who ignore the quotas. Furthermore, the free availability of oil is in our interest since we are the world's largest consumer of oil. The United States should therefore loudly applaud the announcement of the Kuwaiti government in exile that it will not be bound by any future quotas, and we should urge all OPEC members to join in that policy. Besides restoring OPEC quotas, another misguided idea for the post-crisis world, which unfortunately gets some support in the U.S., is talk about redistributing wealth in the Arab world. The United States should strongly criticize calls for wealth redistribution. For one thing, the aid recipients in the region have done a remarkably bad job with the funds they have been given, and there is no reason to think that they would do better in the future. The worst user of aid funds in the area was, of course, Saddam. Under his rule, Iraq wasted $40 billion in Arab aid, plus another $40 billion in non-Arab loans. Iraq is poor because of leaders like Saddam, who has ordered that priority be given to completing his latest $20 million palace despite the crisis his country faces. Saddam is not Robin Hood. He is a hood who robs. Iraq's poverty has nothing to do with a lack of resources. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world, which have been developed slowly only because of Ba'athist stubborn opposition to working with international oil companies. Iraq is blessed with land so rich it was called the Fertile Crescent. For 3,000 years, Iraq exported food until the land reform of 1957 made Iraq into a food importer, and Saddam's stupid policies drove down agricultural output. Iraq grows less food today than it did in 1957, a record more catastrophic than any country except 2 or 3 in Africa. The real contrast between Kuwait and Iraq is between competence and incompetence, not between the rich and the poor. Kuwait should reject as offensive any calls to subsidize Iraqi mismanagement. Post-crisis Kuwait will face 2 major internal problems about which the United States should make its opinion known, though of course the solution is up to the Kuwaitis. The first issue is the role of foreigners. Kuwait's strategy was to rely permanently on foreign labor without offering those laborers any prospect of becoming citizens. This policy has proven to be inappropriate because it weakens the social fabric and alienates the countries from which the immigrants come. The United States should not be shy about deploring the failure to offer citizenship to long-term residents. Those who are born and raised in a country where they then work all their lives should have the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Kuwaitis should not be surprised that Palestinians reject the responsibilities of citizenship when they are not offered the corresponding rights. If Kuwait is unwilling to permit immigration, then Kuwait should take steps to replace the foreign labor within a reasonable time with Kuwaiti labor. Incentives should be provided to automate routine tasks, and Kuwaitis should be encouraged to do manual labor rather than to remain in undemanding and high-paid government jobs. The second issue is democracy. The United States should not hide its preference for a fully democratic form of government. Of course, we should be realistic. That means we should judge by the standards of the region, and we should applaud progress, even if the results remain short of our ideals. By these standards, Kuwait, pre-crisis, was among the best in the Arab world, which unfortunately is the most undemocratic region on the globe. If nothing else, the present crisis has proven how deep was the Kuwaiti people's support for their government. It is stunning that Saddam Hussein has been unable to find any Kuwaitis of note to denounce the ruling As-Sabah family. However, we must make clear our support for the decision of the government in exile to reinforce the role of the parliament. The decisions about their political future are up to the Kuwaitis, of course, not to us. But we should not be shy about making our preferences known. Friends can disagree, and hopefully they can learn from each other.
Thank you, Mr. Clausen. Iraq is indeed a very rich country. During the Abbasid dynasty, Iraq was feeding 30 million people, and now is unable to feed 17 million. Mr. Anthony Korsman.
I've been asked to talk about a remarkably grim subject, which is the impact of a war on Kuwait. But I think I should caveat that with an introductory point. The alternative of not having a war may well be the destruction of a state. It may be the destruction of a people. We have heard some of the introductory changes taking place, but I think over time it is a strategic fact that Iraq has no need of a city-state. It has no need of the Kuwaiti people. Indeed, it has very little need, if any, for anything like the foreign labor force that existed in Kuwait before the invasion. It needs a port, it needs oil, and it needs refineries. There is no strategic benefit to Iraq of maintaining the shell of a Kuwaiti state, and I think over time of months or years, inevitably the result would be the destruction of Kuwait by means other than conflict. But having said that, we are not talking about a minor war. We are talking about well over 600,000 men, some 6 layers of defensive and counter-offense capability, more than 40 division equivalents, and in excess of 4,000 tanks, which are either deployed in Kuwait or will be deployed by some time in mid-January. We're talking about a war which could be fought in layers of conflict from the southern border to the northern border, along the coast, throughout the country. Such a war will inevitably, if it occurs, sweep through most of Kuwait. I can't predict how well given Iraqi forces will fight. No one can. But some unquestionably will fight well. They have fought well in 8 previous years of conflict. The war could last from days to weeks. There is no clear way it can be terminated on the northern border or in Iraq. The end game is the one thing we cannot be sure of, because we cannot talk about invading and conquering all of Iraq. Having said that, however, one must remember that some 95% of the Iraqi troops in Kuwait and in the area are not in Kuwait City or any of its suburbs. The primary defensive lines are not where Kuwaitis live or where there are homes. The primary areas of conflict will be in the central area and probably to the west. And before this conflict starts, there will be a massive air campaign. And there is at least the possibility that as Iraq suffers the devastation of that air campaign, it will terminate the conflict without a prolonged land conflict. I don't personally believe that that will happen, but it can happen. So what we are really talking to ultimately is not the damage to desert, but the damage to the Kuwaiti people and the damage to Kuwait's underlying wealth. Not things which can be quickly rebuilt, but the risk that Kuwait might lose its oil reservoirs or its oil capabilities over time. Let me begin with the kind of damage that might occur to the Kuwaiti people. We cannot rule out the prospect of hostages. There will be Kuwaitis who can be captured, seized, put into the front lines, put into strategic targets. Whatever has happened to the Western hostages, there is no way to prevent Iraq from taking Kuwaiti hostages and scattering them even among Iraq. If that happens, I have to say quite frankly, in war, that hostage-taking will have to be ignored. There will be no rescues. There can be no possibility that targets can be avoided. In this kind of war, war is only successful through shock, through decisive military action. And the only thing we can do is to threaten economic reprisals and to step up our air attacks. We cannot deny Iraq this option or rescue the hostages if it happens. In terms of the Kuwaiti people, we must also understand that there are very real and very serious risks. If Iraq chooses to make Kuwait City or any populated area a citadel, no one has ever found a solution to rapid urban warfare. It is fought street by street. Technology does not dominate. If you deal with a determined enemy, the only way to deal with that enemy is almost on a one-for-one basis. The most you can do is use artillery and tanks with infantry support to destroy buildings. If that happens, the risk to civilian casualties rises. There is no way to avoid this. It is a risk which, if Iraq chooses to fight in Kuwait City, and if its troops choose to fight well, we cannot avoid. Once again, our only option is to threaten reprisals, to step up strategic bombing against Iraq, and to increase the cost to Iraq to the point where it would not risk that kind of war. There is the risk of a scorched earth policy by Iraq, and I will discuss that in a moment. There is also the fact that we will have to inevitably destroy certain targets in Kuwait to paralyze the Iraqi forces. This means we will have to destroy the water plants in Kuwait, the desalination plants, any surplus fuel facilities that can provide rapid fuel supply, and any key infrastructure points which can be used to supply the Iraqi army. That sounds perhaps more drastic than it really is. Moving water quickly in to supply the Kuwaiti people, moving food quickly in to supply the Kuwaiti people is not that great a logistic task. The problem is one which can be dealt with, but it is not one that can be ignored. There is also the risk that as Iraqi troops retreat, we will see looting, pillage, murder, and rape. The history of Iraqi forces in disarray is not one of a well-disciplined and a well-organized army. There were in Iran atrocities. there will almost unquestionably be atrocities in Kuwait. I have to say, quite frankly, that everyone now in Kuwait who is a Kuwaiti or non-Iraqi will almost inevitably be forced to be part of the resistance, regardless of their intentions today. Thousands of Kuwaitis and foreigners may die. Tens of thousands will unquestionably suffer. I would have to note, however, that no one in World War II, under very similar circumstances in the countries occupied by the Axis, ever objected to being liberated. And quite frankly, I cannot believe that the Kuwaitis are going to object to being liberated today. Now let me turn very briefly to material issues. There will be some damage to roads and infrastructure. Will it be any worse than what the Iraqis, as Pat has already pointed out, have already imposed? Frankly, I doubt it. Military action against infrastructure is selective. It serves quick purposes. It is not intended to achieve lasting destruction. I mentioned the problem of water and fuel. Inevitably, there will be equal damage to airfields, to radio facilities, and to other key military targets. These are repairable, and I think most cases the damage will be limited. The problem is not what the Allies will do to Kuwait in liberating it. It is what Iraq might choose to do to Kuwait in attempting to hold on to its gains. Kuwait could easily lose perhaps some $10 to $20 billion more in fixed facilities, possibly refineries and ports. But this would depend on Iraq successfully pre-mining and pre-chambering. It takes months to achieve this level of damage with explosives. If Iraq has not actively been involved in making good on these threats now, it is very unlikely that it can make good on them in the process of a retreat. By and large, even with far greater forces in World War II, threats to enforce scorched earth on cities were generally failures unless they were the product of truly massive campaigns. And that leads us perhaps to the last threat. That is the threat of mining the oil wells. Now, there are approximately 1,000 wells in Kuwait, and it is probable that many of them have explosives planted near the wells. We have no experience and no way to know how many of those explosions will actually produce a lasting fire and a major conflagration, or will produce some sort of short explosion, a minor fire, or simply seal the well. A major oil fire is a major problem. It takes about 2 weeks for one of the crews that can fight those fires to put one out. There are really only 2 crews in the world which could functionally do this, so we are talking a maximum of 1 or 2 oil well fires that could be suppressed in a given week. If 100 or 200 wells were burning, we could see a major series of fires and months, perhaps more than a year, to put these fires out. Having said that, however, it's very doubtful there would be serious damage to the reservoirs. It is extremely doubtful that it would be a sweeping, massive destruction of Kuwait's oil export capability, which would affect the vast majority of its wells. My guess would be that you could see crude oil begin to flow again in several weeks to several months. Even under the worst case, I think it is difficult to see how you would not have 50% of Kuwait's oil production online again in 3 to 6 months. And again, I think we have to be threatened, we have to be prepared, rather, to both threaten and enforce reprisals. In dealing with Iraq, the issue will always be, will they take the risk of actually doing this? And the answer may well be, not if we are willing to act with sufficient force. In conclusion, let me just make a few points. First, I think from what we have heard, Iraq is worse than a war to liberate Kuwait. I think the Kuwaiti people in Kuwait would agree with that. I think every people which has faced liberation in the past has agreed with that. Iraq may break because of the air and land attack. The scenario I have given you may be a pessimistic one, There is no way to find out unless we attempt liberation. Finally, one basic military fact. The more decisive we are in conducting the air campaign against Iraq, the more likely it is not to fight in Kuwait. The more forces we use in trying to liberate Kuwait, the more decisive we are, the more momentum we have, the more shock effect we have, the more likely it is that the Iraqis will break or retreat in ways which minimize the casualties to the Kuwaitis and other foreigners inside Kuwait. The worst conceivable scenario, if you wish to liberate Kuwait, is one of waiting, of graduated escalation, of attempting to pause and negotiate in mid-conflict. That, to my knowledge, has never succeeded militarily in achieving its objective. It has never been a tactic which did not, going back to the Middle Ages, produce a devastating increase in damages to the civilians involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony Korsman. I think we have a time for a couple of questions. Any questions? Please.
I'm Marshall Wiley, retired. Can you go to the microphone, please?
Microphone.
Yeah, I'm Marshall Wiley. I'm retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. I'd like to ask Mr. Korsman, what are his estimates of the U.S. casualties that would be involved in an attempt to retake Kuwait? I've heard various estimates on this.
This is a question which gets asked constantly, and the honest answer is we don't know till we fight. I think it is unlikely, given the assets we will have in the area, that you would see much more than 7,000 to 10,000 American casualties. Out of those, it is very unlikely that you would see more than 10% killed. That, I think, is a relatively pessimistic estimate, which is based on Iraq fighting an extended land war until it is decisively not destroyed, but outflanked and forced to surrender. The casualty estimates, depending on the success of the air campaign and depending on whether any Iraqi ground units should break, could be significantly lower.
Any other questions? Please, sir.
David Silverberg, Defense News, for Mr. Korsman. Two weapons that I'd like him to address. One is the potential effect of Iraqi ballistic missiles in the conflict. And the second thing is the effect or the potential use of psychological warfare by the U.S. and its allies against Iraqi troops that are already deployed. Has anybody thought of that? Is there any potential for weakening resistance using that?
Well, let me take them in order. I don't believe that the Iraqi ballistic missile threat is particularly serious. The payloads are very limited. The number of missiles which can be launched over time is limited. While it would take time to suppress their missile sites, it would take them a lot longer to achieve any decisive military effects. Obviously, if they were to bring gas or biological weapons into the equation without using ballistic missiles, the war could be a great deal more serious. I think the risks do not lie in ballistic missiles, but some desperate use of weapons of mass destruction. As for psychological warfare, all I can say is that my brother was in Korea. The psychological warfare between the two Koreas was awash. My memory of Vietnam was that by and large their psychological warfare outpointed ours by about 10 to 1. What the Arab states can do in terms of psychological warfare against the Iraqis is another story. What I have seen to date of American psychological warfare against the Iraqis indicates we had better put our trust in the Arabs.
Thank you. I think our time is over for this panel, and I would like to thank the panelists and thank you all for your patience.
you.
Not at this moment, I'm just trying to concentrate
There's no way you can't just
Our next group will discuss liberation and the future of regional security. The moderator will be Dan Pipes, who is the director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Dr. Pipes received his bachelor's degree and his PhD from Harvard, both in history. He's traveled around the world, lived abroad 6 years, 3 years in Egypt. He's taught at the University of Chicago, at Harvard, and at the U.S. Naval War College. He's served in 3 positions at the Department of State, 2 in Washington and 1 in Geneva. Dan is the author of 6 books on the Middle East and Middle East affairs, with the foreign policy of the United States being centered in the Middle East, the crisis of the Middle East these days. He's become something of a media star, and those of you who watch the evening news or the McNeil Lair or all the other may be familiar with him. And as I say, he is the director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Dan Pipes.
Thank you, Jack. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Lugar, who's been senator from Indiana since 1977, who is the Republican leader of the Senate Agricultural Committee, a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and who has taken a distinct and a strong position on the current crisis in the Gulf. With no further ado, then, I'd like to welcome Richard Lugar.
Dan. This panel discussion of Beyond Kuwait is one in which most of the discussion, either officially or unofficially, has been very sketchy. I've been one who suggested from the outset that certain in-game results ought to lead to a change in leadership in Iraq, and likewise to control or disposition of chemical and nuclear warfare potential. That is a position well beyond the one taken by our government, and certainly beyond the United Nations resolutions upon which we are acting currently. The President has been careful to make certain that in his own official pronouncements, those of the Secretary of State and others in our government, there was no ambiguity that we were working with the UN and we were working in fulfillment of those resolutions, which are to lead to Iraq leaving Kuwait and presumably to some type of conference or negotiations on the future of Iraq and Middle East security after that. Now, during a meeting of some members of Congress for the President last Friday, I took the occasion, as did others, to suggest that the agenda clearly for the President and his planners must encompass the post-withdrawal period. Clearly, as each of you logically would point out, there are 2 basic scenarios, one in which Saddam Hussein withdraws completely, partially, haltingly, but withdraws in some fashion, and the other in which he does not withdraw, and military sanctions, military action occurs, and conflict occurs and destruction occurs. In my judgment, our government does not have a firm position on the post-withdrawal or the post-war situation as the case, and needs to have one rapidly.
Clearly, some basic elements of informal discussions include such thoughts as the sanctions continuing, in part or in full, as now imposed by the United Nations. Clearly, the sanctions having to do with military shipments into Iraq or anything of strategic military value to the country. In a visit that some senators had with ambassadors to the Permanent Five at the United Nations recently, we found general agreement among the ambassadors to the Permanent Five, as well as from Perez to KR, that it would be useful for sanctions to continue if serious negotiations were to go forward on some control of the nuclear and chemical options, as well as Iraq's place in the Middle East and in the general scheme of nations at that point. When pressed at Senate hearings, Secretary Baker has gone no farther than to say that these are important issues, that he envisions, as he has pointed out several times, a group of nations, probably those surrounding Iraq or generally in the neighborhood, being a group that would deal with Iraq, try to provide some security apparatus in negotiations with that country. The Secretary, when pressed, has never indicated officially or decisively that the United States would be one of those nations. So I suspect that from here on, I offer only my own personal points of view, which clearly are that the sanctions should continue in the event that there is even complete withdrawal by Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Clearly should continue throughout any partial withdrawals, the totality of the sanctions of the United Nations. I believe firmly the United States ought to be involved in those negotiations and ought to be seriously considering involvement in a more permanent arrangement in the Middle East. This is a debate that I suspect our country was about to have generally in terms of the permanence of our involvement in military arrangements in Europe, with the continuation of NATO or what would follow, and likewise in the Asian theater. It may be, many feel, premature to discuss how the United States physically would be involved in the Middle East, precisely where United States forces would be hosted, be stationed over that period of time. It may be that a part of our policy has been not to frighten nations in the Middle East by suggesting a permanent United States presence, and the sensitivity of trying to host that sort of situation permanently would be too awesome and in a delicate situation such as we have now. And I understand that, but I, as a private senator, just offering points to you this morning, I believe the United States really has to be involved really in each of these theaters, and that the post-Kuwait period offers a remarkable opportunity for the setting up of a security system in the Middle East, which we have not had and which we would need to have in the same manner as such would be desirable in Europe and in Asia. It appears to me that we do need to see as a part of the end game the control of the chemical and nuclear potential of Iraq. It seems to me that that is a very important feature. Those who point out that in the event that there is a battle, that some or all of those elements may be destroyed, would terminate the argument in that way. The more hopeful situation in which Iraq withdraws from Kuwait leads, it seems to me, to a much more difficult pattern of negotiations in which the leverage to get a handle on these facilities is not at all clear and requires really the most urgent thought on the part of our government, others allied with us at this point. Now, furthermore, the separation of the leadership of Saddam Hussein from the elements of Iraqi military power requires a very great deal of thought by our country and others allied with us. It would appear to me to be an important and desirable objective of these negotiations. So for the moment, I suspect this conference is timely and that it simply brings an agenda to the fore that both scholars as well as policymakers, activists in this area need to consider. I know for a fact at this moment that the degree of consideration by our government in this area is is minimal, to say the least. The preoccupation with the current operations, the fulfillment of the UN situation is uppermost in our minds. But this is why I take this opportunity to say that I believe, first of all, the United States should be involved. I believe the leverage of the sanctions should be maintained in the event of a peaceful outcome of withdrawal. But very clearly, our final goals, it seems to me, still must be a downsizing of the Iraqi military, a separation of its leadership from those elements, and control over the nuclear and chemical elements. And failure really to come to grips with these, it seems to me, is to present additional problems down the trail that are very substantial. And they will be substantial not only for the Middle East, they will be substantial for this country. The United States has made an enormous investment of time and personnel in the Middle East. It will not pass without note that if we fail, at least having attempted to organize the countries of the world in this manner, and having had some success in deterring aggression against other states, and hopefully in making certain that the principle that aggression will have no rewards is established by withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, to fail in the peaceful solution and the work out of some type of Middle Eastern security system would be a most egregious failure, given the momentum we have going for us in the organization to date. So I call upon our government, our colleagues in the Congress, to be helpful in helping to formulate a strong policy and to do the planning now as opposed to post-January the 15th or other appropriate dates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Lugar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Mel Levine, who has been representative from the area of western Los Angeles since 1983, is a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House, and more particularly the Subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East. And I'm informed that he's just returned from a trip to Saudi Arabia. Congressman Levine.
Dan, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here in such distinguished company and to have heard some of the proceedings already this morning on what is an important series of panels on a very important subject. And as Dan indicates, I did just return from Saudi Arabia, and I think anybody who goes there, and I want to say this just very briefly in beginning, it's not the general subject of this speech, but anybody who goes there cannot fail but to be extremely impressed and encouraged by the quality of the American military, its morale, its commitment, its determination to do whatever job they are called upon to do. I hope very, very much that Saddam Hussein has even the remotest idea of the quality, the morale, and the commitment of the American military, because that's a message that I'm not sure that he receives as well as he should from the advisors that he has in Iraq. But let me tell you that any American would be extraordinarily proud of these young men and women who we have in the Saudi desert who are clearly committed to doing whatever job is necessary in terms of the challenges before us as a nation. I also very much enjoyed the Senator's comments and found myself, as I frequently do, in a great deal of agreement with him. I do want to emphasize, upon returning from this region, that the Middle East and the Persian Gulf are clearly among America's most vital areas of national security. And in light of this fact, that there should be absolutely no doubt in the mind of Saddam Hussein that the American people and the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, are prepared to defend our vital interests in this region and prepared to do so with force if force is necessary. The deployment of U.S. forces has also set the stage for the long-term questions which are the subject of this panel today, questions pertaining to long-term American involvement in the region, which is the subject that I've been asked to focus upon. Regardless of the outcome of the Kuwaiti crisis and irrespective of whether military force turns out to have been necessary or not, the United States must clearly continue to play a pivotal role in the Gulf for some time to come.
Now that East-West tensions have subsided around the globe, the Middle East poses, I believe, the greatest danger of widespread military conflict on this globe. The Arab world remains practically untouched by democratic change, and the Middle East retains inherent potential for conflict and for instability. As such, I believe we in America must be prepared to make a long-term commitment to achieve peace and stability in the region. Without some United States presence in the area, a power vacuum could exist which could only be filled by a resurgent Iraq, a resurgent Iran, or a power-hungry Syria. None of these options represents a hopeful future for peace and democracy in the region. Any of these options could squander whatever gains may result from the current international deployment of forces. A long-term U.S. role in the Gulf can very well provide the anchor for a fundamental renewal of the region if it is used properly. For example, our presence in the region could be a catalyst for democratic development and for improved human rights conditions. We should act to restrain rather than to encourage regional arms races in the long term in this region. A properly structured collective security arrangement which includes the United States could significantly enhance stability and could lessen the risk of future inter-Arab conflict. And I believe that it is imperative that we use our presence in the region to move Arab states toward peaceful relations with Israel. These goals will make our long-term commitment worthwhile. And I believe that without moving toward these goals, American public opinion is likely to reject this long-term commitment. For long-term American military and economic commitments must be grounded in basic American values. I believe that in the context of these values, Americans do and should have deep and heartfelt concerns for the outrageous treatment of the Kuwaitis who have been treated despicably by Iraq. At the same time, it must be understood that the stakes in the Gulf amount to far more than the restoration of a small Gulf monarchy. However, to make our ultimate aims achievable, we must lay the groundwork even now and not wait for the immediate crisis to subside in terms of American objectives in the region. My sense of urgency may seem odd, as I was among the doubters when Secretary Baker first floated before the House Foreign Affairs Committee his idea for a collective security arrangement. Obvious questions immediately arose about what collective security might entail and how it would be formulated. How could it be a new NATO, as some suggested, without the existence of parliamentary democracies? Would it be designed to counter just Iraq, although other powers in the region have sponsored aggression as well? Would it aim to balance power among the Arab states? How would it affect Israeli security? And I want to emphasize that congressional concerns about these issues on both sides of the aisle remains high. And these congressional concerns have been heightened by some skepticism and concern over administration policy in several areas. First, its proposal for a massive new arms sale to Saudi Arabia, which raises very serious questions about the arms balance and the arms direction in the region. Second, the administration's absurd distancing of itself from Israel when that only emboldened Saddam Hussein. And thirdly, a perceived attitude that in our eagerness to maintain a strong coalition against Iraq, the Bush administration has gone overboard to ignore the objectionable policies of our coalition partners when they conflict squarely with American interests. For example, the President's embrace of Hafez Assad was offensive and unnecessary, and I believe that this is only the most egregious of what appears to be a disturbing willingness on the part of the administration to sweep human rights abuses under the rug for fear that they might damage the anti-Iraq coalition. Although I have generally high marks for administration policy since August the 2nd, it has fallen short in dealing with some of the long-term concerns which are the subject of this panel. Instead of using this crisis to advance American and democratic values in the region, which is absolutely essential in terms of American interests in the region, the administration has inadvertently encouraged Saddam Hussein by allowing our United Nations support for Israel to be diluted and by obtaining no noticeable signals from our Arab coalition partners that they are any closer to normalizing their relations with the State of Israel once the crisis subsides. While we have for years received private assurances from a number of Arab leaders that they will move toward such a clear American goal, nothing in this crisis so far suggests that we are any closer to a public translation of these assurances, or perhaps more importantly, that the administration has been pushing nearly as aggressively as it ought to for this goal. It is impossible to build a lasting security relationship that will have the support of the American people if we continue to deny our interest in democratization and if we pretend that Arab hatred of Israel is beside the point. Our long-term role in the Middle East cannot end up being a mere policing action to defend the status quo. We must also realize that we cannot put together a lasting security arrangement for the Gulf by relying on a balance of terror among Arab powers. Long-term peace and stability is best achieved by implementing an international arms control regime for the entire region, including Israel. The President should summon all of the skill and the patience that he demonstrated in putting together the current international coalition to develop a similar international coalition devoted to post-crisis Mideast arms control. This coalition would restrain the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons of mass destruction, as well as the conventional weaponry that has proven so destabilizing even until this day. Now that we have authorized all the weapons that the President has said were necessary for Operation Desert Shield and even more, the question of additional arms sales, such as the proposed second phase of the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, which raise serious questions about Gulf policy, should be deferred until after this Gulf crisis is over. The Kuwait crisis itself, I believe, is the best advertisement on this globe for the need for Mideast arms control. Billions of dollars of previous arms sales did not protect Kuwait or Saudi Arabia from Iraq. Massive new arms sales will make them even more inviting targets that only direct American intervention will be able to rescue. And the experience of Iran, and now Kuwait, dramatizes the danger of some of the world's most sophisticated weaponry falling into unintended hands. Instead of reflecting on this unfortunate history and on the volatility of the arms sale debate at this time, some arms sales proponents are attempting to use this crisis as a vehicle to inject billions of dollars of additional American military equipment into the region. We should reject that policy and instead use the newfound moral and political force of international collective security in conjunction with our Western allies and with the Soviet Union to prevent others as well from supplying arms and to develop a multilateral framework for arms control throughout the Middle East. I believe it would be a tragedy if instead of laying the groundwork for democracy and stability, we provided the seeds for a future conflict by failing to address the fundamental problems of democratization on the one hand and arms control on the other. I am aware that these are not ideas that will necessarily appeal to every one of our allies in the anti-Iraq coalition, and that is precisely why we must begin to address them today, while we are clearly demonstrating beyond any prior expectation our commitment to protect Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states to further these policies. While Secretary Baker and others have indicated that all things are possible after the Kuwait crisis is resolved, and I certainly hope that that proves to be the case, it would be a tactical mistake to set our long-term interests aside in the near term for the time being. Not only would this set a precedent which would be difficult to overcome, but the American public will not in the long term support a high-cost, high-stakes policy which is not grounded in fundamental American values and fundamental American objectives. Progress in these areas will provide much of the justification, the payoff, if you will, for sustained American involvement in the Gulf. We have made clear, as we should, our commitment to the security and stability of the Gulf, our implementation of long-term goals such as the improvement of human rights, Arab-Israeli peace, democratization and regional stability and prosperity will go a long way to compensate for these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Levine. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Wolfowitz, who is Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He's been in this position since May of 1989. He's had a distinguished career in government since 1973, in which I counted 8 prior positions, including one as Director of Policy Planning in 1981-82, and that was a time I worked for him. So it gives me special pleasure in introducing my former boss, Paul Wolfowitz.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be on the panel with 2 distinguished gentlemen like the 2 who have preceded me, and the kinds of considerations that they've been raising not only here today but in the Congress and in the general public, I think, are contributing very much to a debate that we have to have, a discussion that we have to have. I could not agree more strongly with Senator Lugar's comments about the need to look beyond the present and look to the future. Americans have taken perhaps a slightly unfair hit in the history books as people who focus on winning the war and forget about winning the peace. But certainly we're guilty as charged with respect to the aftermath of World War I. And I think we're fairly guilty with respect to how we conducted World War II, although it's certainly the case that afterwards we scrambled and put together a peace that, particularly with the hindsight of the dramatic events of the last year, suggest we did pretty well. But it's terribly important that we do well in this one also, and that the kinds of sacrifices that people are being asked to make, and possibly the even greater sacrifices they might be asked to make in the future, be rewarded by long-term security, long-term stability, and long-term progress. And I was struck, as Congressman Levine was, by the extraordinary quality and dedication and commitment of the men and women that are serving out there. And I was struck also by what I would call their vision, that when you ask them why they're there, it really almost invariably came down to, we have to make some sacrifices so that our people, our country, the world is safer in the future. And we all have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that that comes true. I would also add, just before I get into my prepared remarks, certainly don't want to get into debate with a friend here today, but I do think in defense of the administration, I think we have that balance in mind, but it is also important to recognize that the most important thing is to succeed in the short term. There will be no long term if we don't succeed in the short term. That does mean some friends, although I wouldn't use the word friends, but some associates is a better word that we might not be as close to in other times. But I don't think we've been swept off our feet. I think we have kept some perspective, and I think it doesn't hurt to be reminded from time to time about the need to do that. But the most immediate focus is how to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and if it becomes necessary to use force, how to do it in a way that minimizes the costs to Americans, American soldiers, airmen, Marines, and Navy. How we deal with the Kuwait crisis will determine the kind of security role we and other nations will play in this region for many years to come. It will also influence the framework of security relationships in the post-Cold War period. The end of the Cold War and how this interacts with the Kuwait crisis will have important effects on how the United States and its allies anticipate, prepare, and plan to meet security commitments into the next decade. A few months ago, my office was seized with the issues of dramatic drawdowns of units and equipment from Europe, worldwide force reductions, and force restructuring. In fact, we prepared a briefing in anticipation of a major presidential speech. We prepared a briefing that Secretary Cheney and General Powell were going to take to the Congress about the reshaping of our force posture, and that briefing took place on the morning of August 2nd, but as you can imagine, there were a few other subjects on the agenda that morning. We were anticipating just a few months ago these dramatic drawdowns in Europe, and now today many of the units that we had destined earlier to be disbanded, and much of the equipment identified to be removed from active service are now in Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Desert Shield. Those units that we had planned on withdrawing from Europe are withdrawing from Europe, but not to come home and to be demobilized, but rather to head into the most dangerous place in the world right now. In certain cases, our experiences in Desert Shield may, in all likelihood, lead us to modify some of our previous plans for force reductions and equipment phase-outs. The A-10, I think, is an example of an aircraft that was slated to be terminated that is now getting another look. Likewise, lessons that we learned from Desert Shield may require us to alter past concepts of military and political planning for the Persian Gulf region. We have already seen the beginnings of what I believe will ultimately be a more multinational approach to sharing the responsibility for security in a region of vital interest to many countries. Our security interests in this region are unlikely to change regardless of the outcome of this crisis. We expect a basic continuity of U.S. interests there well into the 1990s to foster regional stability, to preserve our access to oil, to protect American lives and property. The United States will have an enduring interest in regional security. It is not in our interest that any nation militarily dominate a region that possesses over 2/3 of the world's proven oil reserves. Nor is it in America's interest to permit intra-regional conflicts to disrupt the world economy or our freedom of access to international routes of trade or commercial sources of oil. And that is why it is so important when this crisis is over that we have a more stable balance in the region than the one that has confronted us in the past. It's difficult to speculate on the enormous range of various possible outcomes of this crisis, other than to say that it must end with Iraq out of Kuwait. And I would point out to everyone, and if somehow Saddam Hussein hears this discussion, as he hears so many of our discussions, everyone should notice that there is almost no disagreement about that goal. We're debating the means, but there's very little dispute about that end. It is difficult to predict whether Iraq will continue to be a threat or not after this crisis is over. It is clear, however, that the U.S. interests I have outlined will continue to be challenged by interstate warfare, by the possible destabilization of key regimes, and by terrorism for many years to come. This area is likely to continue to be beset by deep-rooted grievances, unsettled border disputes, and a propensity for violence. We and our allies must be prepared to meet these and other challenges despite our own constrained budgets. We and our allies are faced with greater necessity, therefore, to cooperate in protecting the stability of this region. Although, as I've said, our focus has been, I think appropriately, on the short term, on how to manage the immediate crisis, we have also already begun talks with a number of our coalition partners about longer-term security in the Gulf. These discussions are still preliminary, and it's certainly much too early to comment or speculate on their outcome, other than to say that I'm encouraged by the prospects and by the realism that many countries are showing. Long-term security planning is, of course, somewhat scenario dependent. But the centerpiece, I think, of any post-crisis planning will be a strategy to contain any further Iraqi aggression. It must also include steps to significantly tighten arms control measures aimed at blocking Iraq's nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. And I would indeed associate myself with Congressman Levine's hopes that it could include broader arms control measures as well, although here too I think one should not let the best become the enemy of the good. The most immediate problem will be controlling Iraq's armaments. We are fully aware of the difficulties that any long-term American military presence could cause for us, and even more for the countries of the region. We do not want to stay any longer than we are needed. We've made clear to all the governments involved that we will leave when we are asked. We are, however, looking at ways to develop an effective and politically acceptable security system with our friends in the Gulf. The political sensitivities and the wishes of those countries currently hosting Allied forces will largely determine the framework of future defense arrangements. Those may evolve within the context of an invigorated Gulf Cooperation Council as a continuation of the present coalition in some form, or more likely, I would think, some combination of the two. This crisis, I think, has demonstrated that the countries of the Arabian Peninsula will continue to need outside help to defend themselves against their stronger neighbors to the north. Some of that help may, perhaps undoubtedly will, have to come from us, but we certainly want to see this continue to be a coalition effort, indeed, if possible, to be more of a coalition effort in the future. The moderate Arab countries, Egypt particularly, have a particularly important role to play. If we ever do have to send U.S. forces to the region again, we need to be able to do so, I think, much faster than we did this time. What we did this time was extraordinary. I think you've heard statistics that in the first 5 materiel as in the first 5 months of the Korean War. The statistic that amuses me more is in that same period of time we moved a volume of cargo equal to the volume of the Pentagon itself, and some have suggested we would have done better to just move the building. It's been an extraordinary effort, and yet I think it's also clear, and clearer, it was clearer than we wanted to make it at the time, that it was too slow. If we ever have to go again, we have got to go faster. This could ultimately mean pre-positioning programs in some countries at the invitation of some Gulf countries. It might include the continued presence of some of the Arab forces already deployed as part of Desert Shield. It is also possible that post-crisis planning among the non-Arab coalition members may focus on developing logistical capabilities, particularly lift capability to deploy into the region if there is another crisis. This is clearly an area that needs improvement for a number of countries. Whatever its final form, I believe, it will be built on a principle strongly advocated by the Gulf states themselves, that the first line of defense protecting the Arabian Peninsula must be the responsibility of those who live there. This, I think, means providing the weaker states an ability to defend themselves, to put up that initial line of defense. And I think it includes improving Saudi defense forces to be capable of attriting and delaying an Iraqi armored advance during the first critical hours and days of an attack. To outline what I think are the key components or guidelines of such a notional security arrangement, and in a very tentative way, I would say first that it must be developed by the regional states themselves. It cannot be imposed on them. The Gulf states should have the primary responsibility, or I might say the initial responsibility, for defending themselves. However, they will also surely require outside involvement and assistance. Third, our own ability to send reinforcements rapidly will have to be improved. But I would emphasize that there are many ways to do that without establishing a permanent U.S. presence in the region. And finally, the moderate Arab countries, Egypt particularly, would play a central role. The long-term implications of this present crisis for our military force structure, our future defense budget, U.S. planning, strategy, presence and security relationships in the region, and for our economic security are significant. These issues will require time and the support of both the American people and Congress to correctly address them, but I am confident that we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Wolfowitz. We have exactly 10 minutes, and I would ask those who like to ask questions to be very, very terse. Please.
I'm Amos Perlmutter, and I refer to my friend Paul Wolfowitz. First, we congratulate you for what you did, and I congratulate you for what I don't know you're going to do. And therefore, I'm going to ask you an easy question. Maybe that's not the time to ask it, but one should. It has strategic and explosive political implications. And this is the insignificant role that Israel plays in that tacit coalition of which it is part, whether the others members of the coalition do not admit that. Everything is fine and dandy now. Israel should stay low. It has no intention to do things of its own. Nevertheless, if an airstrike will take place, and Saddam Hussein is desperate, and a missile flies to Israel, what is for Israel to do? To bomb the same areas that the United States did, or to do other? And what is therefore the coordination between the United States and Israel in such an outcome, being a tacit member of the coalition and being target number one of Saddam Hussein in the long run?
I'm not going to answer the question, and I don't think you expected me to, but I'm delighted that you gave me the opportunity to say something that I think is very important. I've heard a lot of nonsense over the last few months about how this crisis demonstrates that with the end of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union gone as a significant threat, that we no longer need strategic cooperation with Israel, and this crisis proves it. First of all, I would say any particular crisis only proves what's relevant to that crisis, and as someone said, history has more imagination than the people who write scenarios for us. There have been regional crises in the past in which the Soviet Union had no role to play, where Israel played a crucial role in preserving stability. There may be some in the future. Israel's most important role today is staying out, maintaining this low-profile posture. But what has to be emphasized is that is not something that is easy to do. It can only be done with considerable effort. It can only be done by an Israel that's strong enough to be confident that with a low profile it can defend itself. It can only be done by an Israel that is able to communicate enough with us to understand what is going on and to think ahead to its options. And the farthest I'll go in answering your question is to say those are very live questions to which a lot of thought has been given in this country, in Israel, in many of the Arab countries, and I think the kind of cooperation we have with a number of our friends in the region, including Israel, give me reasonable confidence that if we face that kind of situation, we'll be able to handle it.
Ibrahim Owais from Georgetown University, where the primary objective of this conference is to remove all the traces of aggression against Kuwait and the conditional withdrawal from Kuwait, in addition to, of course, reparations imposed against Iraq. I would like to pose a question to Congressman Levine, because one of the main points that he mentioned is that the Arabs should move to have peace with Israel, and of course, Arabs on record to complying with the United Nations resolutions in this regard. But the question is that it is really, peace is in Israel's court. The ball is in Israel's court. You cannot have a lasting peace in the Middle East while aggression still continues against the Arabs and the Palestinians. There are, of course, the main question is that there are definitely atrocities that are done in Kuwait, and there are atrocities that are made in Israel and in Palestine's occupied territories. The question is why the United States created a linkage between dealing with the Palestinian issue and dealing with Saddam Hussein, because there are positive and negative linkages. The fact that the United States does not
could you simply ask a question and finish?
With the Palestinians,
this is not an opportunity to editorialize.
With the Palestinian question is that it had created an actual linkage between both.
Well, if I understood your question correctly, it was why did the United States create a linkage? And in fact, as the United States' policy is appropriately not to create any linkage whatsoever. The President, the Secretary of State, others in the administration have consistently emphasized that it would be absurd and inappropriate to create any linkage whatsoever, particularly when these two issues are as diametrically opposed as they can be. Kuwait is clearly the victim of wanton aggression and has been occupied by an aggressive force. The problems that exist with regard to Israel and the West Bank and Gaza are a result of Arab aggression against Israel, in which Israel was acting with regard to the right of self-defense to maintain her survival over a period of the last 40 or 42 years. So what I worry about is, and the reason I emphasize this in my remarks, to the extent that the United States, even by inference, backs away from Israel at the United Nations or looks like it is accepting even an implied linkage between these two issues, the United States is emboldening Saddam Hussein. It is the wrong policy. All of the words that we've heard from the President and the Secretary of State have been appropriate. I would hope that our actions are consistent with those words. The UN is currently considering a resolution that I would think the United States should very candidly say that it intends to veto. This is the we have to make sure that there is not even an implication of linkage. As the rhetoric suggests, the policy should follow that rhetoric.
Yes, David Bowen, Counsel for the National Interest. I'd like to ask my former House colleague, Congressman Levine, if as a part of the search for general peace and security, mutual security in the region, he might be prepared to recommend to the State of Israel, after the Gulf crisis is finished, that that state consider, either through an international conference or some other kind of negotiation addressing the festering wound of Palestine, without which there can really be no general peace or mutual security in the Middle East?
David, I appreciate the question. As Dan Pipes indicated, I've just come back from Saudi Arabia. Our delegation went to both Saudi Arabia and Israel. One of the meetings that we had in Israel was a meeting that the delegation had with Defense Minister Aarons. I asked him in the course of that discussion where the peace process stood, and he used that as an opportunity to emphasize, I think appropriately, and I think the delegation felt appropriately, that there is no country on this globe that more desperately seeks peace than the country of Israel. That Israel has been the victim of aggressive warfare time and again since Israel's existence, and that he hoped very much, he indicated, that Secretary of State Baker would travel to Israel at some point in time so that he could show him some of the military cemeteries where, for example, relatives of every single Israeli family were victimized in one or the other wars of aggression against Israel. From what I gather of Israel's position across the political spectrum, Israel's primary goal is to find a peaceful solution to survive in peace with secure borders in the region. I have felt that the Shamir initiative with regard to elections in the territories offers very substantial hope. In fact, it offers the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza more in the way of self-determination that virtually any Arab country today offers its own population. And I'm very hopeful that as soon as possible we can move back to this type of a process. I think it would be folly to suggest that a peace can be imposed upon the parties in the region, but I have no doubt that Israel's highest priority is the pursuit of peace.
It's with the greatest of regret that I have to close this session, but I do so on orders from on high because the room has to be closed in preparation for the Vice President's talk. So if I could give you a set of complicated marching orders. We'll go now to lunch. Lunch is for those who are either pre-registered or have a card for admittance. Lunch is to the left, through the Buchanan room and into the Pierce room. I ask you to leave your belongings here because you'll not be able to bring them back with you. The room is only for participants, not for their belongings. So please leave your papers here right now. The ballroom, this room, will be closed for an hour until 1:15. Lunch will be over at 1:15. I ask you to go to the lunchroom with dispatch, to return to, please, one more minute, just a little bit of logistics. But because the Secret Service is involved, it's got to be done right. Please listen. You need to go to the ballroom, to the lunchroom to the left now and return at 1:15. Appreciate you doing it with dispatch. Please leave your belongings in this room. Thank you very much.
David, always good to see you.